Hello everyone. Today we are going to start with part 4 of Fundamentals of Economics. Now we're going to study the comparative advantage theory. Before the comparative advantage theory was given by David Ricardo, there was another theory that was existing for international trade, and that theory was called as absolute advantage theory, which was given by Adam Smith. So earlier there is a theory called as absolute advantage theory, after which the comparative advantage theory came up. The absolute advantage theory was given by Adam Smith, and the comparative advantage theory was given by David Ricardo. In case of absolute advantage theory, as per this theory, countries should specialize at producing whenever it is best at whatever it is best at producing. For example, if country A is producing 50 apples and country B is producing 8 apples, that means country A it has to specialize in producing apples because it produces out of these two countries it is best at producing apples, so it has to specialize at producing apples. So that is what is absolute advantage theory. In case of comparative advantage theory, it states that though a country is specialized at producing two products, it would still be beneficial for it to just produce one product if the other entity has lower opportunity cost for the production of the other good. This will be better understanding once we look at the example. So we'll understand what is comparative advantage theory after looking at the example. Now let's understand the absolute advantage theory through this example. First we'll be understanding absolute advantage theory, then let's go to comparative advantage theory. So as per absolute advantage theory, India is producing 100 apples, whereas Canada is producing 80 apples. And in case of tomatoes, India is producing 120 tomatoes and Canada is producing 60 tomatoes. So which country is producing the highest number of apples out of India and Canada? We are assuming that there are only two countries and there are only two commodities, and now we are thinking whether who should be producing which of these in order to execute the international trade. So, as per the absolute advantage theory, first we'll see in case of apples what will happen. In case of apples, what we can notice is out of India and Canada, India is producing more apples. India is able to produce 100 apples, whereas Canada is producing only 80 apples. Similarly, when you look at tomatoes, India is producing more tomatoes, 120 tomatoes, whereas Canada is producing only 60 tomatoes. So, India is producing more tomatoes. So, India is producing more. So, India has an advantage at producing apples. India has an advantage at producing tomatoes. So, as per absolute advantage theory given by Adam Smith, in this case, India has to produce both apples and tomatoes and export it to Canada. So, as per absolute advantage theory, India should produce both of these apples and tomatoes because because it has an absolute advantage over the production of apples also and tomatoes also. That's why it will be producing both apples and tomatoes, and it will execute international trade by exporting this to Canada. And Canada will import apples from India, and Canada will import tomatoes from India. Why this is happening? Why this scenario gets established? It gets established because of the fact that India is having an absolute advantage at producing both apples and tomatoes. That's why India will be the one exporting, Canada will be the one importing. Now let's understand the comparative advantage theory. Now let's understand what is comparative advantage. As per comparative advantage theory, before that, we need to calculate the opportunity cost. Let's calculate the opportunity cost. In the case of apples, okay, in case of India, apples were producing 100, tomatoes we are producing 120. So to produce, so 100 apples is equal to 120 tomatoes. Let's equate it. Okay, I'll explain how to do. Okay, is equal to 120 tomatoes. 100 apples is equal to 120 tomatoes. Now let's find out how much it is. So 1 apple is equal to 120 divided by 10, that is 1.2 tomatoes. It's equal to 1.2 tomatoes. So what did we find out here? We found out that 1 apple is costing 1.2 tomatoes. 1 apple is costing 1.2 tomatoes. Now similarly, this is happening in case of India. This we calculated in case of India. Now let's calculate the same in case of Canada. In Canada, how many apples we are producing? We are producing 80 apples. In Canada, we are producing 80 apples. And how many tomatoes we are having in Canada? In Canada, we put all our resources to full use. In Canada, we are able to produce 60 tomatoes. 60 tomatoes. So again, 0 0 gets cut. 2 3s are, 2 4s are. So 4 apples is equal to 3 tomatoes. 4 apples is equal to 3 tomatoes, or if you want to write it in terms of apple, let's write as 1 apple is equal to 3/4 of tomato. 3/4 of tomato. 1 apple is equal to 3/4 of tomato. So it will be equal to 0.75, right? So 1 apple is equal to 0.75 tomatoes. Now what are we understanding out of this? What are we understanding out of this? We are understanding that to produce 1 apple in country A, the cost of producing 1 apple in country A is equal to 1.2. 1.2 T. Let's not take it as tomato if it's confusing. Let's just take it as 1.2. So apple's production cost is 1.2 in India, whereas apple's production cost is 0.75 in Canada. So which is cheaper? So which is cheaper? This what we're checking right now is called as the opportunity cost. So which is cheaper in this case? In this case, 0.75 is cheaper because 1.2 is greater than 0.75. Because in India to produce 1 apple, we are giving up 1.2 tomatoes. Whereas in Canada, to produce the same one apple, we are just giving up 0.75 tomatoes. We are giving up only 0.75 tomatoes. So what should we be producing? So Canada should be the one who should specialize in the production of apples. So Canada should be the one which should specialize in the production of apples. Now we calculated this in the terms of apples, and we came to conclusion that in case of apples, it is better that Canada produces. In case of apples, we came to conclusion that let Canada produce apples. Canada has to specialize the production of apples. So I mentioned it as C here. So I've written it as C. So Canada should be producing apples, and the reason is because it has a lower opportunity cost. Because it has a lower opportunity cost. Now let's calculate in terms of tomatoes. So let's calculate in terms of tomatoes. Okay, so we know that 1 apple is equal to 0.3 tomatoes. Now the other way around, when we take 1 tomato is equal to, this will be 0.83. How did you get 0.83? I've just done simple division. I've sent I just sent it this side. Like if 10 apples equal to 12 tomatoes, then 1 tomato will be equal to 10 by 12 apples. And 10 by 12 is nothing but 0.83. That's how I calculated this. Now let's calculate the next. Here how much is 1 tomato? 1 tomato is equal to 1.33 is equal to 1.33 apples. Okay, is equal to, this also is equal to same. Okay, I'll just write it in this color to avoid confusion. Okay. Yes. So now what do we observe? Now what do we observe? We observe that in India, if we are producing tomato, For producing tomato, we have to sacrifice 0.83 apples. In Canada, if you're producing tomato, we need to sacrifice 1.33 apples. So in which country are we sacrificing more apples? We're sacrificing more apples in Canada. That is the second country. In Canada, we're sacrificing more apples. Hence, since we're considering the opportunity cost is lower in case of India for the product tomato. So India has to specialize. In case of tomato. So India has to specialize in case of tomato. I'll explain this again in case there's any doubts. So there's India and there is Canada. First, what we saw was the absolute advantage theory. In absolute advantage theory, under the absolute advantage theory, India is supposed to produce both apples also, tomato also. Why India has to produce both apples also, tomato also? Because when we are just looking at the chart, we can make out that India is having an absolute advantage at producing apples, and it has got an absolute advantage at producing tomatoes also. And how is it is? See, because we're just looking at the numbers. 100 is greater than 80. So India has an absolute advantage in apple. 120 is greater than 60. Therefore, India has an absolute advantage in tomatoes. So absolute advantage theory, in that we're just looking at which country is able to produce more. Which country is able to produce more, that country has to specialize in that particular product. So this was absolute advantage theory. Now let's keep it aside and now just look at this theory. This theory is called as comparative advantage theory. In comparative advantage theory, what we're trying to say that let's not put the burden entirely on one country to produce both the goods or both the products. Instead, as per David Ricardo, both, even though India has having an absolute advantage at producing both apples and tomatoes, still there will be an India will benefit if it is having an international trade. And why he's saying like that? Why is David Ricardo claiming like this? He's claiming like this because of opportunity cost. He is claiming this because of the opportunity cost. If I am producing only if I'm producing apples and if I'm producing tomatoes both. If I'm producing apples, I'm sacrificing 1.2 of tomatoes, which is more, right? But if I'm producing only tomatoes, I'll be sacrificing 0.83 of apples. So we are calculating the opportunity cost and trying to understand which one we should be producing. If we are just looking at this particular part, let's not look at Canada's part. Let's just be in India and look at what's happening in India. We found out that for one apple, we have to sacrifice 1.2 tomatoes. To produce one tomato, we have to sacrifice 0.83 apples. So in this case, in which of these two situations, which is a better situation? The better situation is this particular situation, because in this one we are sacrificing 1.2, which is greater than 0.83. So here we are sacrificing more and here we are sacrificing less. If you're getting confused, just look at the numbers. Just look at it as see, in case of A, sacrifice is 1.2. In case of tomato, sacrifice is 0.83. So 1.2 is greater than 0.83. So that means this sacrifice is more. So we have to go with tomatoes. So for as a country, as an economy in India, we would benefit if we are producing tomatoes, because we are sacrificing lesser resources in order to produce tomatoes. We are sacrificing lesser apples to produce tomatoes. That's why it's better if we focus only on producing tomatoes. This is one way of looking at it. Now, once India has decided it's going to produce tomatoes, now let's go to Canada section and see what Canada has to produce. What Canada has to produce. Now we see that for producing one apple, Canada is sacrificing 0.75 tomatoes. For producing one tomato, it is sacrificing 1.33 apples. So which one is greater out of this? Out of 0.75 and 1.33. 1.33 is greater. That means 0.75 is least. So Canada has 2. That means 0.75 is a lesser sacrifice. So Canada will be at an advantage if it is producing apples. And the reason is the opportunity cost is lesser. And the reason is that the opportunity cost is lesser. Okay, this is what is called as comparative advantage theory, wherein we are trying to, when they were saying that if a country can produce both, if the country is good at producing both the commodities, both the products, still it has to participate in the international trade, and it has to choose one product in which it is having a lower opportunity cost, and it has to specialize only in that product in which it is having a comparative advantage. Okay, for example, in this case, India is having a comparative advantage in case of tomatoes. So India has to proceed specializing only in tomatoes, and it should not specialize in apples. It should specialize only in case of tomatoes. And Canada has to specialize in case of apples. Even Canada will have an advantage. The advantage being that the Canada will have an advantage because Canada will have a lower opportunity cost for producing apples when compared to the opportunity cost of producing tomato in Canada. Therefore, we can conclude that if there's an economy like India which is which is having an absolute advantage in producing both the products, in such situations India will have to find out the opportunity cost and then decide which one out of the two products it is going to produce. Either it will produce apples or it has to produce tomatoes, but not both. It has to find out in which case it is having absolute advantage in both the tomatoes as well as apples, but India has to figure out in which case it has got a comparative advantage. In which case it has got a comparative advantage. Like how we had seen that India had got a comparative advantage production of tomatoes. So since India has got a comparative advantage in production of tomatoes, so India has to go ahead producing tomatoes and exporting it to Canada, and then Canada has to produce apples and export it to India because Canada is having a comparative advantage. Canada is having a comparative advantage at producing apples. So Canada will be exporting apples and India will be exporting tomatoes. In this way, both the countries are specializing in one product at which it is having a comparative advantage. So David Ricardo, he focused on the concept of comparative advantage. He said that look at the comparative advantage and then decide which country has to produce what item and then you continue trading. By chance tomorrow it happens that if there's one country which is having all kind of resources and it can produce everything, but there's another country which is not good at anything, it's not having an absolute advantage at anything, then as if you're following Adam Smith's approach of absolute advantage theory, that other country will have to keep importing from India, will have to keep importing from the country having absolute advantage, and and its economy will get destroyed because it's only importing. So in this is why David Ricardo came up with a comparative advantage theory, and he said that both the countries have to figure out which product they have to specialize in, and how they're going to figure out. They're going to figure out by finding out which country is having a comparative advantage at producing which product, and whichever product for which they're having a comparative advantage, they have to produce that and sell it. This is called as comparative advantage theory. Comparative advantage theory shows that trade can make everyone better off. So, if you're following this theory, even country one will be happy, that's India will also be happy, like we saw in the example, and Canada also will be happy. But if following absolute advantage theory, one country is fully exporting, India will be fully exporting, whereas Canada will only be importing. So that will create a disadvantage for Canada. But in case of comparative advantage theory, that's not happening. India is exporting only one product and Canada is exporting one product, because of which both the countries are happy and both the countries are better off. Thank you so much for watching the video. Please do like and subscribe. Thank you.